Good day, dear children. Today, let's do a lesson in your Snapshots textbook, Chapter 7 Birth, written by A.J. Cronin. Cronin was a Scottish novelist, dramatist, and a non fiction writer born on 19th July 1896, and he lived till 6th January 1981. He was one of the most renowned storytellers of the 20th century. He practiced as a doctor over a decade before devoting himself entirely to writing. He has produced several bestsellers drawing from his experiences as a doctor. His best known novel is The Citadel, published in the year 1939, which tells us of a Scottish doctor in a Welsh mining village. And Cronin himself had seen the venue as a medical inspector of mines and as a doctor in Harley Street. This lesson is an excerpt from The Citadel, and the central character is Dr. Andrew Manson, newly out of medical school and has just begun his medical practice as an assistant to Dr. Edward Page in the small Welsh mining town of Blaney. As he is returning from a disappointing evening with Christine, his girlfriend, he is met by Joe Morgan. Joe and his wife, who have been married nearly 20 years, are expecting their first child. This is where the story begins. Though it was nearly midnight when Andrew reached Bringover, he found Joe Morgan waiting for him, walking up and down with short steps between the closed surgery and the entrance to the house. At the sight of him, the burly driller's face expressed relief. Doctor, I'm glad to see you. I've been back and forward here this last hour. The missus wants ye before time, too. As you all know, the story is set in the mining town of Blaney, and Joe Morgan is a driller. Driller is a person who works at the drilling controls on the rig floor, and he expresses how pleased he was to see Dr. Andrew. He tells the doctor that he has been waiting there for him for about an hour, and then his wife needs him to examine her even before the time of her child's birth. She is in a critical situation. On hearing this, Andrew had a sudden flashback of the unpleasant night he had with his girlfriend, and without wasting further time, he is getting ready to go with Joe Morgan. Andrew, abruptly recalled from the contemplation of his own affairs, told Morgan to wait. He went into the house for his bag. Then together they set out for number 12, Blaina Terrace. The night air was cool and deep with quiet mystery. Usually so perceptive, Andrew now felt dull and listless. He had no premonition that this night call would prove unusual, still less that it would influence his whole future in Blaney. So here you find that both Doctor and Joe Morgan are moving to Morgan's house, and Andrew, who generally was full of life and spirit, was silent and lacked energy, and he had no idea what the night had in store for him and that it was going to influence his life in Blaney. They both walked silently till they reached number 12. The two men walked in silence until they reached the door of number 12. Then Joe drew up short. "I'll not come in," he said, and his voice showed signs of strain. "But man, I know ye'll do well for us." So here Joe revealed to Andrew that he does not intend on coming in, but he showed full confidence in Andrew. Joe's voice was tense and under pressure. Inside, a narrow stair led up to a small bedroom, clean but poorly furnished, and lit only by an oil lamp. Here Mrs. Morgan's mother, a tall, grey-haired woman of nearly 70, and the stout, elderly midwife waited beside the patient, watching Andrew's expression as he moved about the room. "Let me make you a cup of tea, Dr. Buck," said the former quickly after a few moments. Andrew smiled faintly. He saw that the old woman, wise in experience, realized there must be a period of waiting, that she was afraid he would leave the case, saying he would return later. Don't fret, mother, I will not run away. Down in the kitchen he drank the tea which she gave him. Overwrought as he was, he knew he could not snatch even an hour's sleep if he went home. He knew too that the case here would demand all his attention. A queer lethargy of spirit came upon him. He decided to remain until everything was over. Mrs. Morgan's mother offered Andrew a cup of tea. Other than her, an elderly midwife was also present in the room. She affectionately treats Andrew, and realizing that the old lady might be worried about him leaving during the waiting period, he gave her a gentle smile and comforted her by assuring that he will not go away. And immediately doctor understood that she was wise and had plenty of experience. He sipped the tea in the kitchen downstairs. Though he was mentally and physically exhausted because of the unpleasant incidents that happened, he knew it was impossible for him to even get an hour's sleep if he went home. Although new in his line of practice, he was aware that the situation was critical and called for his attentiveness. Strangely, he felt a bit active and decided to stay at the place till his duty was fulfilled. An hour later, he went upstairs again, noted the progress made, came down once more, sat by the kitchen fire. It was still, except for the rustle of a cinder in the grate and the slow tick-tock of the wall clock. No, there was another sound, the beat of Morgan's footsteps as he paced in the street outside. The old woman opposite him sat in her black dress, quite motionless, her eyes strangely alive and wise, probing, never leaving his face. It was the time of the night when everything was still, and the only sounds that came was of the ticking clock, Joe's footsteps, and while doctor waited in the kitchen, Mrs. Morgan's mother sat in front of him, and she looked at him constantly with her wise eyes that were filled with hope. His thoughts were heavy, muddled. The episode he had witnessed at Cardiff Station still obsessed him morbidly. He thought of Bramwell, foolishly devoted to a woman who deceived him sordidly, of Edward Page, bound to the shrewish Blodwen, of Denny, living unhappily apart from his wife. His reason told him that all these marriages were dismal failures. It was a conclusion which, in his present state, made him wince. He wished to consider marriage as an idyllic state. Yes, he could not otherwise consider it with the image of Christine before him. Her eyes, shining towards him, admitted no other conclusion. It was the conflict between his level, doubting mind and his overflowing heart which left him resentful and confused. He let his chin sink upon his chest, stretched out his legs, stared broodingly into the fire. He remained like this so long, and his thoughts were so filled with Christine, that he started when the old woman opposite suddenly addressed him. Her meditation had pursued a different course. Dr. Andrew, while he was waiting, he was still being haunted by the incident that took place at Cardiff Station. He began thinking of his friends and acquaintances who have had bad experiences in marriage. He thought of Bramwell, that's the first person he thinks of. The woman he loved had cheated on him. The second person is Edward Page. He thought about the relationship of Edward Page, who was committed to a dominating woman named Blodwen. He then reflected upon how Denny is living away from his wife not so happily. All of this brought him to an inference that made him apprehensive. He wished to believe that the institution of marriage was a cheerful one that guaranteed peace and companionship. He also had no other reason to believe otherwise, with Christine's shining eyes in his mind. He was undoubtedly facing a conflict in his mind. He thus rested his chin on his chest and pulled out his legs while he glanced at the fireplace. He sat still for a few moments, his mind still preoccupied with Christine, until the old lady broke her silence. Okay, we continue. Susan said not to give her the chloroform if it would harm the baby. She's awful set upon this child, Dr. Buck. Her old eyes warmed at a sudden thought. She added in a low tone, "Eh, we all are, I fancy." He collected himself with an effort. "It won't do any harm, the anesthetic," he said kindly. "They'll be all right." Here the nurse's voice was heard calling from the top landing. Andrew glanced at the clock, which now showed 3:30. He rose and went up to the bedroom. He perceived that he might now begin his work. Here Mrs. Morgan's mother is telling Dr. Andrew about Susan's wish not to have anesthesia if it would affect the child. Suddenly, they heard the voice of the midwife calling upon them. Andrew saw that it was already 3:30 and he is all set to work. An hour elapsed. It was a long, harsh struggle. Then, as the first streaks of dawn strayed past the broken edges of the blind, the child was born lifeless. So here you find that it took doctor almost an hour to perform the surgery. It was a rather tough one, and while the first rays of daylight came inside from the corner of the window, the Morgan's child was born. Unfortunately, the child was cold and still. It was lifeless. As he gazed at the still form, a shiver of horror passed over Andrew. After all that he had promised, his face, heated with his own exertions, chilled suddenly. He hesitated, torn between his desire to attempt to resuscitate the child and his obligation towards the mother, who was herself in a desperate state. The dilemma was so urgent he did not solve it consciously. Blindly, instinctively, he gave the child to the nurse and turned his attention to Susan Morgan, who now lay collapsed, almost pulseless, and not yet out of the ether, upon her side. His haste was desperate, a frantic race against her ebbing strength. It took him only an instant to smash a glass ampule and inject the medicine. Then he flung down the hypodermic syringe and worked unsparingly to restore the flaccid woman. After a few minutes of feverish effort, her heart strengthened. He saw that he might safely leave her. He swung round in his shirt sleeves, his hair sticking to his damp brow. As the doctor continued to look at the lifeless child, a shiver passed down his spine. He was confused. He couldn't get himself to choose between addressing the stillborn or the miserable mother. He could not make the decision consciously, so he intuitively addressed the mother first while giving the child to the nurse. Susan laid unconscious too, as the effects of the anesthesia, that is the ether, still persisted. He put in all his efforts to bring her out of the desperate state, even while her strength continued to weaken. He instantly broke the medicine's glass to fill the syringe and injected it into her. He worked tirelessly to bring her to her senses. After a moment, when he was assured that she was safe and her body was beginning to regain its strength, he turned his attention to the child. Here we come to the end of part 1. Thank you.